I think it goes without saying that today we live in a deeply divided society, or what I call a dichotomous universe. Dichotomy basically means oppositional forces, divisions, two sides that have no way of reconciling their positions. From that point of view, at least from the point of view of, say, us humanists out here, we can't settle for that, right? We have to believe that there are human values and there are societal values that we all must have in common, which means that we have to be willing to transform our societies for the better. With that in mind, dichotomies are false. There's no such thing as this side or that side, white or black, yet we keep constantly reinforcing these divisions. Why are we doing this? Well, a lot of it's pretty straightforward. We do it because we are socialized to do it. Even in our religious teachings, we embrace the very fundamental idea of good and evil. And even in Western thought, or at least in Western philosophy, we also understand dualisms from the point of view of rationalism. It was Rene Descartes who was instrumental in defining this sort of distinction between mind and body. Mind being the component that thinks, the body that doesn't think. So when you understand the implications of that kind of philosophy, you can see why it leads to a lot of what you would call, say, dominant subordinate positions. And what you have whites dominating blacks, where black people are thingified by the result of their black bodies and not being subjects that think. You can see how this also leads to the subjugation of women, the objectification of women. You can see how this led to post-colonialism in terms of the objectification of the other. These types of dichotomies reinforce dominant subordinate relationships over time. So what do we do about it? Well, it's challenging because we are struggling with dichotomies even today. Let's just face our political situation. We have Republican and Democratic parties, dueling forces all the time. And as a matter of fact, every time we watch the news, all we're really reading about is how each side is trying to dominate the other. They don't really engage in what really they're supposed to be engaging in, which is a democratic process, which is something I think a lot of us who are Americans have truly valued, that there's a democratic process that helps us to supersede those types of dichotomies. In our age, however, we have come to embrace dichotomies actually as the norm, as something that we desire. We are in a system right now where it's winner take all. And we put so much energy into the election, who's going to win, because we know that after the person wins, there's no democratic process. It's a winner take all system. And so it's ruthless. All we are exposed to now is just pure ruthlessness. So what do we do as citizens? What are our options? One thing I would recommend that we do is first recognize that dichotomies are our enemy. Dichotomies are false, and we have to come up with strategies for how we overcome these divisions. And one way of thinking about it is to use dualistic frameworks to mirror that dichotomy and then find ways to break it down. So, for example, let's take issues that are, and there are numerous issues like this, but just say, what's the perfect dichotomy? Funding the police and defunding the police. That's the perfect dichotomy today, right? Now, if you were committed to transcending that dichotomy, you would say, okay, let's focus on some objectives here. What are the objectives for defunding the police? What are the objectives for funding the police? Make a whole list of those things, and then find out which one of those things are actually in common. Like, what do both sides have in common? That's sort of like a polarity thinking model approach to finding common objectives. But here's the thing. There are three different outcomes that can be produced as a result of a need to transcend dichotomies. One, you can have, two divisions. My thumbs represent two sides. You can find some kind of midway point somewhere in here where both sides come together and they sort of come to some common solution. But when they arrive in the middle, it really becomes almost like a status quo solution. No real change is actually made. And what winds up happening is those feelings that lie underneath that ultimately give to the kind of divisions we see today are just waiting to emerge. The other option is to think of the dichotomy as being a triangle. So it's more like transcendent. You have the two sides here, but when you seek solutions, the solution is up here. So people do turn to religion or spiritual things or idealistic views that tend to be transcendental. They go upwards. Okay, that's an option. But what you really want is for those two sides that are on this line to transcend to another point in space and time so that both sides are transformed and society is transformed. We want to work toward transformation, but that means everyone has to be a part of that process, right? It's not an easy thing to do. The battle should take place and probably should take place in every sphere of social life, of course, but really needs to take place in the field of representation because that's where the battles are taking place. I mean, every time we pick up an article is about some controversy that happened on Twitter or TikTok or what have you, or Facebook. And this is how we are doing battle with the world today through representations. So how do we view representations in light of these dichotomies that are bombarding our universe? Well, one way to look at it is to think of every representation as being inherently dichotomous, as having an obverse and a reverse, as being a sign that has a concept and a signifier. Two things that are irreconcilable in themselves, but must ultimately be resolved through some kind of active engagement. So I made reference to the sign. Sign is a term that I derived from semiotics, and signs have been defined as dyadic and triadic, but we just focus on dyadic, which kind of resembles the sort of dichotomous universe that we happen to be in right now. You can see that the sign has this inherent tension of being able to reconcile the concept, that is the idea behind the representation. Say maybe it's a police shield, okay, that's your sign, and you have a concept of it. And then you have the representation of it, which could be the word shield or a picture of a shield. The problem with those correlations is that they're not actually fixed. The fixed meaning of the concept's relationship to the representation is largely dependent on the viewer who's constructing it. It's not inherently logical. So if you find people who are on two opposing sides, they're going to view that representation differently, and they're going to have a different concept of what underlies the meaning of that representation. So the representation is a field of contestation, and I think that's one way to begin to look at the world critically, at least right now, is to not think of anything as being self-evident. Everything you see as a form of representation is a dangling signifier, representing something that is only temporal at best. If we can embrace the idea that the sign is not inherently dichotomous, it's not inherently dyadic, the concept doesn't have a natural connection to its representation, that the representation is arbitrary, then we can begin to view every form of representation that way and begin to actually not so much just be 100% cynical of everything, but to be able to understand that the meaning that is being invested into our representations are part of a shared universe, right? And that we ultimately are going to be able to arrive at that meaning through dialogue. Now, the dialogue is challenging because most of what we see going on in the social media realm is actually not dialogue. It's actually not social. It's actually unidirectional. It's people responding to comments, but it's largely through the force of its productivity, that its meaning is being addressed. It is not done in any constructive way at all. So we have to be constructive in how we go about things. So we're using dualistic frameworks to analyze our current positions, whether we are using polarity thinking, or if we are using semiotics to decipher the sign, or if we're using it in a social Marxist sort of way and visioning how we can transcend social conflicts by using a kind of dialectical method, then at least this way we are working towards some kind of change. But doing it in a way that is constructive. It has to be done in an environment that is constructive. It has to be done in a school or a business or a community center, or a political sphere. In some way where it is done in a constructive way with the ultimate goal to transforming the world that we're in. That's my immediate thoughts on the situation. I would like to give some more thought to how to more formally work out those differences, those oppositions that we are currently facing, but that's sort of one way to begin to look at things.